In the spring of 1972, the staff of Esprit magazine organized a roundtable with Michel Foucault about the role of social workers in France's then new urban public housing. These were the multi-family apartment buildings the government was building for the dangerous classes. France was creating neighborhoods similar to the neighborhoods that in the USA are called the projects. An architect in this panel discussion, whose name was Virilio, this architect remarked, "One could say that history passes through three stages. First, the self-regulation of primitive societies. Second, the regulation of our societies. And third, we're heading toward a species of deregulation through the urbanization that we've been talking about, which itself is a new phenomenon because today we talk of global cities." So Virilio, this architect on this panel with Foucault, and others observe that the time is coming, if it's not already here, when the marginal population, the plebeians who are not proletarians, will be the majority. I'm going to comment first on Virilio's three stages and then on Foucault's reaction to Virilio's suggestion. Self-regulation. Now, in French, the connection between self-regulation and rules is quite clear. The French word for rule is règle. Régulation is the fact of assuring a form that is regular. Régulier. When in conformity with the rules. So without romanticizing primitive societies, one can acknowledge that in their great variety, they exhibit many customary ways of patterning social relationships with rules, also known as norms, or sometimes we would use other vocabulary, but the idea is there's some regularity in social relationships, some form of integration in Durkheim's language. Now, Virilio can be read of echoing those of us who say that humans are a species biologically coded to be culturally coded. We are capable of self-monitoring and of mutual monitoring in groups. Virilio's second stage, regulation. Now, skipping over civilizations that are neither primitive nor our societies, Virilio refers to, as is clear from passages I have not quoted, especially to European social democracy. Remember, this is 1972. The European social democratic welfare states that we're already beginning the process of decline under the impact of globalization. Regulation is identified particularly with regulating the economy to produce full employment with plans and industrial policies and make it possible to transfer large parts of the surplus generated by the economy to the social sector, and with administering social safety nets that provide cradle-to-grave security for all citizens. So that's when he says regulation, he's talking about our societies, which is Western European social democracy at the time. It's a key word because it's the social democratic regulating of the economy. This is a point Habermas makes in the legitimation crisis. It's the regulating the economy that makes comprehensive social security possible. Now, deregulation. Here, Virilio echoes what Hannah Arendt, in her phenomenology of contemporary society, calls a crisis of authority. As social democracy declines, the breach between the numbers of people who can be integrated into society through satisfactory, steady, well-paid employment and the numbers of people who arrive in the city, either by birth or by migration, is a widening breach. The proletariat is becoming a smaller proportion of the total population. The marginals, formerly known as the lumpen, are becoming a larger proportion. Here, Foucault interjects a remark making a contribution to what Virilio is saying. Foucault says, and furthermore, says Foucault, some workers who are employed or not unemployed, some workers voluntarily marginalize themselves because they prefer to live a life of crime and drugs to the boring jobs that they really don't find very satisfying. So in this resulting chaos, neither the customary norms of primitive societies nor the discipline provided by steady employment in regulated societies governs daily life in the suburbs of Paris where the dangerous classes live. The social workers, remember this is a panel discussion about the role of social workers. The social workers are assigned the impossible task of stemming the tidal wave of social disintegration produced by urbanization and marginalization. Okay, Foucault speaks next. The vocabulary he employs differs from Valerio's vocabulary as rules differ from power. In that respect, he implicitly answers Valerio, or at least expresses a different way of talking, displays a different way of seeing, but the question Foucault directly addresses is not whether Valerio's three stages are valid, but instead a different question raised in an earlier intervention in this panel discussion by an historian named Vuillard. The question, Vuillard's question, which Foucault addresses, is the social worker in effect a police officer? The implicit function of the social worker, Vuillard had said, was to maintain order. Now, Foucault mainly agrees with what Vuillard said. He elaborates in it. Foucault elaborates by saying that the functions of the social worker and the functions of the police are subsets of a broader and more comprehensive social function that Foucault names surveiller et corriger. Now thus he anticipates the title of a book he's going to publish 4 years later, Surveiller et punir, Discipline and Punish. Correction, in turn, we're talking about vigilance and correction. Now, correction, in turn, has two parts. One part of correction is punishing, the other part of correction is educating. So those who perform this broader social function of vigilance and correction include, besides the social workers and the police, the priests, the psychiatrists, and the teachers. A recurring theme in Foucault's thought is that in the modern world, psychology and medicine have replaced religion. Psychiatrists have replaced priests. What used to be called sin is now called sickness. The medieval alliance of religion and nobility has become an alliance of medicine and law. A young person whose fate is to be born in one of the poor suburbs of Paris, where the non-proletarian plebeians are marginal, in other words, the plebeians who don't have steady jobs, a young person born in that sort of environment will almost inevitably end up either in front of a judge or in front of a psychiatrist. And it doesn't really matter much which it is. The similarities between life in prison and life in a mental hospital are greater than the differences. Nor is being in school much different from being in a jail or being in an asylum. The teacher, too, has inherited the function of the priest of yesteryear, maintaining order, in the words of Vuillard, or surveillance and correction, in the words of Foucault, soon to become discipline and punish. The significance of the proliferation of social workers in the world's great cities, according to Foucault, is that the political power has lost confidence in religion and has lost confidence in education. The priests and the teachers are too independent. Political power prefers social workers because the social workers are more directly under their control. Now, Valerio, going back to this architect who talks about self-regulation, regulation, and lack of regulation, does not see the lumpen through Foucault's Nietzschean lenses, that is, focusing on power, but rather through Durkheimian lenses. Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist who talks a lot about norms and roles. For Valerio, the integration, another Durkheimian term, for Valerio, the integration into society of those who are now marginal would be desirable if it could be achieved. If Valerio's thought seems to be that if we could somehow revive the best of the self-regulation of early societies with sort of coherent belief systems that people were socialized into, if we could replace atomistic individualism with norms of reciprocity and mutual obligation, If we could appeal to the deepest sentiments of a species that has lived in tribal groups as hunters and gatherers for the bulk of the time it has existed on the planet, if we could only revive the best of the regulation of social democracy, if we could revive faith in humanity and the universal declarations of human rights, including the now standardly accepted right to cultural diversity and individual diversity, if this time around we could make economic and social democracy work, we deepen it, thus achieve higher levels of inclusion and equity, such a devoutly to be desired synthesis of primitive self-regulation and modern regulation would save us from the deregulation that's now turning the world's great cities into hell on earth. I take some such proposal to bring the lost sheep back into the fold to be Valorio's subtext. I agree with it. That is, I agree with what I think I discern reading between the lines of Valorio's remarks. At earlier stages of his career, Foucault would have agreed with Valorio too, or at least with parts of Valorio's apparently Durkheimian way of thinking, suitably rephrased. But in 1972, Foucault will have none of it. In the short, tumultuous years between 1969 and 1972, Foucault became a professor at the Collège de France. Before that, he became the head of the philosophy department at the experimental university at Vincennes. And then just a little bit later, he became a professor at the Collège de France. And that means that this wonderful French institution called the Collège de France means once you get appointed to that, you'll be highly paid for the rest of your life, studying the history of systems of thought. That was his chair, while teaching 12 classes a year to report on the research done. Also, in that short time, Foucault became a revolutionary. The same philosopher who had devoted himself to refuting the revolutionary philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre now works together with Sartre. Now I have to qualify something I said before, in case anybody remembers it. Somebody might remember that I once said that when Sartre and Foucault marched together in demonstrations, Sartre was being a general intellectual and Foucault was being a specific intellectual, even though they were marching down the same street, carrying the same slogans for the same cause. What I said before was true enough for later years, but in 1972 it appeared for a time there was not only practical collaboration between the two of them, but also a theoretical convergence. Some of Foucault's new ideas were published by Jean-Paul Sartre in his journal, Les Temps Modernes. It was a collaborative exchange between Foucault. This is an article published in Les Temps Modernes. There was an exchange between Foucault and two underground Maoists. These Maoists were underground because there were warrants for their arrest. They were living under pseudonyms, and they conducted a discussion with Foucault, which was then published in Sartre's journal. They were in their clandestine life. Now here Foucault, or now I should say, Foucault reinterpreted his own past. Madness and Civilization now became a study of the exclusion of a particular kind of oppressed person, namely the person stigmatized as mentally ill. Madness and Civilization became defined as the beginning of a general project of studying all the rejected, all the exclusions. Foucault appeared to accept a working definition offered by another speaker at the same roundtable organized by Esprit magazine about the role of social workers in the slums. Oppression, definition of oppression is either surveillance or exploitation or both. So typically the workers suffer exploitation while the unemployed, the sort of marginal population, suffers surveillance. What potentially united them in the cause of revolution was that they were both oppressed. Also, the homosexuals were oppressed. The so-called mentally ill were oppressed. The students were oppressed, and just about everybody was oppressed. So in the birth of the clinic, remember in 1969, Foucault backed away from his earlier work on the birth of the clinic, but in 1971 it became a good example of Marxist sociological analysis done by Foucault. Regarding the order of things, Foucault came to agree with the main point Sartre had made in his critique of it. The book leaves the reader in suspense. It does not offer an account of the social processes, social practices that produced the shift from the classical to the modern episteme. Foucault had already implied in the book itself, and had stated explicitly in his preface to the English translation of it, we're talking about The Order of Things, that this was not a book that tries to discern causal relationships. What was new and now in his so-called radical phase is that he now considers this a defect, a gap that needs to be filled. Foucault is still an anti-humanist, but whereas in 1966, this is really a remarkable shift. He's still an anti-humanist, but in 1966, toward the end of The Order of Things, his anti-humanism means laughing with a silent laugh at revolutionary projects because of the absurdity of the very idea of liberating humanity from its chains. Now, in 1972, humanism is identified with reformists, than whom nobody is more contemptible. So in contrast, for Foucault of 1972, anti-humanism is the philosophy of the revolution. Now, after some Maoist activists, although there's some question what the relationship is between the Maoists in China and the Maoists in France, but these were French Maoists, including Foucault's intimate friend, personal friend Daniel Defer, had suffered the realities of imprisonment. In other words, Foucault's good friend was thrown in jail. Foucault became the principal leader of an activist group, the GIP, the Prison Information Group. It was dedicated to making the French public aware of the realities of prison. But the volunteers who formed the Prison Information Group were not prisoners, and they did not pretend to speak for the prisoners. Their project was to facilitate bringing to the ears of the public the voices of the prisoners themselves, and some voices of others affected by imprisonment, such as the people who go to visit their relatives in jail. Foucault had come to accept Gilles Deleuze's principle that nobody should speak for anybody else. Every Saturday, Foucault stood at the gates of a prison, gathering testimony from those who went in and out. Referring to the work of the Prison Information Group, Foucault wrote, I quote Foucault, "We want to attack the institution just at the point where it becomes incarnate in an ideology so simple and fundamental as the notions of good and bad, innocence and guilt. We want to change the lived ideology through the dense institutional layers in which it is invested, crystallized, reproduced. To simplify, I'm still quoting Foucault, humanism is wanting to change the ideology without changing the institutions. Reformism is changing the institution without touching the ideological system. Revolutionary action defines itself, on the contrary, as simultaneously shaking the consciousness and the institution." So, close quote. So in lines like these I've just quoted, Foucault made it clear that now he wants to be identified as a revolutionary. In May of 1971, the first brochure issued by the Prison Information Group appeared. Its title was Intolerable. On the back cover it declared, "Intolerable are, number 1, the courts, number 2, the police, number 3, the hospitals and the asylums, number 4, the schools and military service, 5, the press, television, and finally, the state." So notice that although Foucault now calls himself a revolutionary, capitalism doesn't make it on this short list of institutions that are intolerable. In a 1971 interview with 4 French secondary school students, where Foucault was the interviewer and the students were being interviewed, Foucault played, as the interviewer begins his interview by asking his young interviewees the following question: what form of oppression do you find most intolerable? Oppression by your parents? Oppression by your teachers? Oppression by the police? Or oppression by the media? Now, if I'd been there at that interview in 1971, I could not have resisted the temptation to follow up Foucault's question to the students with some questions to Foucault. Are you putting us on? Remember, you're the Foucault whose nickname was the Fox. Georges Dumézil, who knew you better than anybody, said you were always wearing a mask and always changing masks. And remember too that Foucault had a great career as a joker. I'll tell you a few of the little jokes in his history. One of them was when he was a French cultural attaché in Uppsala, Sweden. One of the jokes he liked to play was he drove a Jaguar. He had this fancy Jaguar that was his car. And what he liked to do was to dress up in a chauffeur's uniform, and then some impecunious young lady friend would dress in elegant clothing, and he would play the chauffeur, and she would be driven around Uppsala by her chauffeur, the young cultural attaché Michel Foucault, as if she were rich and he were poor. So another of his sort of what I would call, well, I don't know what you want to call it. I would call it being a joker. When he was named chair of the philosophy department at the Experimental University of Vincennes, one of the first things he did was to join the students in throwing rocks at the police. So, so this guy's quite a character. You can't say he's not charming. But so now I want to ask him, you know, if you like to drive around Uppsala pretending to be poor, now are you playing the game of the ultra-radical, more radical than all the radicals, in the radical atmosphere of Paris in 1971? I would ask the same question about the dialogues with the French Maoists that were published in Les Temps Modernes. In those dialogues, Foucault said, any court whatever, is a deformation of justice because it stands between the people and its enemies. Michael Walzer has pointed out that many of the views expressed by Foucault in interviews in the early 1970s were absurd. I quote Walzer. Walzer said, "To abolish power systems is to abolish both moral and scientific categories. Away with them all." So I'm suggesting that Foucault was smart enough to know that they were absurd and that he was playing games at this point in his life. This roundtable, I'm going back to this roundtable convened by the editors of Esprit in 1972 about social workers in the projects. They asked a question. How could the marginalized poor and the traditional proletariat become political allies? At this point, I think Foucault becomes more serious. He's not playing games so much, but he actually has a plausible theory. How can the marginalized poor and the traditional proletariat become political allies? Foucault has an answer. The answer is, teach them that power is their common enemy. From Foucault's works, one might derive a similar question. How can the majority, consisting of the sum total of all the different kinds of people who are marginalized one way or another, become aware that it is a majority? To this similar question, Foucault suggests the same answer. Teach them that power is their common enemy. Power is the general enemy. It's the logical basis of the alliance of all the oppressed. Foucault thus comes out somewhat as you could compare Foucault to Marx, as you compare Einstein to Newton. Marx was the spokesperson for the workers, the oppressed workers, but Foucault speaks for all the oppressed. Newton writes mechanics within a certain limited framework, but Einstein writes a more general physics in which Einstein writes a more general physics in which Newton's physics appears as a special case. John Maynard Keynes also claimed to write a general theory in which the classical economics was a special case, namely the case of full employment, the more general case being the case where normally there's not full employment. Thus Foucault is more revolutionary than Marx because he's revolting on the part of all the oppressed and not simply the oppressed workers. So Foucault, as an activist, put into practice the teaching suggested by Foucault as a theorist. When he wrote the manifesto for the Prison Information Group, he put in the first two sentences, "Not one of us is sure of escaping imprisonment. Today, less than ever." So these words embody a revolutionary strategy. Convince the masses that the cause of the marginals is their own cause. Anybody can be sent to jail. Anybody might be diagnosed as insane and shut up in a mental hospital. Although you might not share the orientation of some particular sexual minority, in the majority of cases there's something about one's own sexual practice that somebody's going to consider immoral. Even if you have no sexual practice, there's somebody who considers that wrong. So therefore, the cause of sexual freedom is the cause of the majority. So even before Foucault had cast power in the role of general enemy, power had been groomed for this position, this role that Foucault gave power as being the general enemy of all the oppressed, had already been prepared in the discourse that the friends of Foucault in Foucault's circles were already using. Whatever else power might mean, le pouvoir, whatever it meant, power was the entity that had reestablished itself after the revolts and revolutions that happened in French history. Now in France, there were revolts in 1848, in 1870, in 1940, and then again in 1968. And every time that there was a revolt, every time you talk about these revolts, what you say is, if the revolt succeeds, you say, the people won. If the revolt fails, power won. So this sort of dichotomy, it's the people versus the power, had deep roots in the way the French understood their own history. There are two other words that appear in this discourse in the early 1970s that are sometimes taken to be synonyms of le pouvoir, synonyms of power, and they are the bourgeoisie and capitalism. So we can say capitalism won, bourgeoisie won, power won. Choosing power instead of one of the other two carried with it a conceptual framework, namely it's following Foucault's Nietzschean turn. Gilles Deleuze, at that time a great friend of Foucault, although they had a parting of the ways later, Gilles Deleuze elaborated an anti-power conceptual framework at the level of a critique of metaphysics and epistemology. Foucault enthusiastically endorsed what his friend Deleuze had written. Now let me try to evoke this image of traditional metaphysics that Deleuze and Foucault, and to some extent some others, you might want to put Derrida here. What was this image of traditional metaphysics that had to be somehow destroyed to pave the way for the revolution? Traditional metaphysics, now I'm sort of speaking the language of Deleuze followed by Foucault, traditional metaphysics, which was revived in a new form by, in the 20th century by Heidegger, had organized knowledge in categories. At the root of all the categories was the concept of being. Being was substance. Being was logos. Being was God. Traditional metaphysics extracted from logic the idea that before anything could be said, there had to be a concept of what it is to be. Once a concept of to be was established, order and therefore oppression was also established. So you remember Foucault at one time, and then he, in the later time too, comes out to be a great fan of, learns a lot from Heidegger, but now, you know, Heidegger is the enemy, a revival of the enemy, and the tradition is the enemy, and what the tradition tells us is that it all comes down to the idea of being. Once you have a concept of being, you have a concept of order, and therefore you have oppression. Deleuze, following Nietzsche, and followed by Foucault, denied that knowledge required any concept of order. Non-being, not being, diversity, not unity, difference, not sameness, was the root of the scientific concept. Thus, philosophy, the way Deleuze and Foucault do it, contributes to social equality. That was their claim. For example, a philosophy that puts all linguistic events on the same level without hierarchy implies that black English is no better and no worse than standard American English. That's an example Deleuze gives. The general enemy was power. The general philosophical strategy of the revolution was to dismantle the conceptual tools for imposing oppression that power over the centuries had fashioned. Now Foucault wrote, in Foucault praising Deleuze, this is quoting Foucault praising Deleuze, to liberate difference, it's necessary to invent a thinking without categories. Close quote from Foucault. Now here's what Deleuze says, praising Foucault. Foucault's book, represents the most decisive step toward a theory and practice of multiplicity. Now, which of Foucault's book is he talking about? He's talking about the archaeology of knowledge. Remember the archaeology of knowledge, where everything is dispersion. So this fits into Deleuze's worldview. Foucault has written a great book. Richard Rorty thought it was his worst book. Deleuze thought it was his best book. It's a book that praises dispersion. And Deleuze says, well, this is a great giant step toward a theory and practice of multiplicity, and that's what we need to carry out the thorough revolution. So following consistently this line of thought, Foucault suggests that some people found his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France troubling. Why did some people find my lecture troubling, says Foucault? Well, it's because I'm hostile to any institution, whatever. So see what Michael Walzer had in mind. It's because I'm hostile to any institution, whatever. And that's a quote from Foucault. It was not a matter of building continually better institutions to replace the defective and in principle improvable institutions humanity now has. It's a matter of resisting power. Since power takes the form of institutions, it's a matter of resisting institutions in general. Similarly, it's not a matter of changing the rules of a given culture in order to live life according to a better set of rules. It's a matter of breaking down the exclusions that distinguish the good people, the ones that follow the rules, from the bad people, the ones who do not. Foucault now endorses whatever is transgressive. Foucault said in an interview, quoting Foucault again, "Intellectuals often make the image of the working class as having the same humanist values as the bourgeoisie. But that is not true. If you look closely at the working class, you will see in the end that it is anti-law, illegalist. It is against law, because law has always been made against it. So rules in general, and not just any particular set of rules, are to be resisted." I quote Foucault again, "It is good, and here it is true theater, to transcend the bourgeois way of life in the mode of play, playfully and ironically. It is good to be dirty and bearded, to wear long hair, to look like a girl when you were a boy, and vice versa." Close quote from Foucault. So when asked what values he would propose to replace humanism and the existing system, Foucault replied that humanism had to be fought, quoting Foucault again, with a cultural attack, the suppression of taboos, the suppression of limitations on sexual sharing, the practice of communitarian existence, the removal of inhibitions with respect to drugs, the break with all the interdictions and closures by which the normative individuality is constituted and guided. We remember, too, that there was a short-lived movement in France to repeal the laws against pedophilia, which Foucault was one of the founders of. So part of the rationale for Foucault's concept of power as a general enemy was that it was a conceptual umbrella broad enough to be the ideology of an alliance among the workers, the homosexuals, other kinds of sexual minorities, the prison inmates, the students, the children, those society judges as insane, and all oppressed people. It followed from his analysis that the existing organizations of the French working class were conservative and anti-revolutionary. The labor unions were conservative, the Socialist Party was conservative, the Communist Party was conservative. Indeed, it follows from Foucault's choices about how to talk and how to see, I'm talking now not Foucault, that's not just the Communist Party that's conservative, but any political party is necessarily conservative. Why do I say any political party is necessarily conservative? Because any political party has to seek votes among normal adults. And we know from psychological research and from sociological research and from common everyday experience that the majority adheres to conventional morality. It tends to defend law and order as it's constituted, however it may be constituted at any given time and place. So it's my opinion that the sort of political strategy of endorsing everything that is transgressive and breaking society's rules is not a strategy that's going to achieve an electoral majority in any election. Well, so much for a brief introduction to what's usually called Foucault's radical period in the early 1970s. Next time, we'll look at Foucault's quite rapid transmutation into becoming one of the most important intellectual leaders of the wave of anti-Marxism that swept through French universities in the middle in late 1970s.